So I'm a huge Spider-Man fan. In fact, that's an understatement. Spider-Man is involved in almost every facet of my life. Here's a photo from my wedding. And as such, I've seen almost every on-screen iteration of Spider-Man, every Spidey movie, and almost every Spidey TV show. And as a fan, I've been hearing for years from anybody who thinks they know what they're talking about that Spectacular Spider-Man is the pinnacle of Spider-Man television. This is the best show. And unfortunately, it's a total blind spot on my radar as far as Spider-Man content goes. And so while I slept on it for years, I finally decided to check it out. And all those people who told me it was the best one, they were right. It's not even close. Folks, it's a great time to be a Spider-Man fan. In fact, I'm willing to say that there are very few times in the history of the character that so many great iterations of the Spider-Man story are coming out and are broadly accessible to fans. And despite some major missteps with the character and the property recently, I'm confident that the best is yet to come, and No Way Home and Spider-Verse were just the tip of the iceberg. But trust me when I say it wasn't always like this. Because being a die-hard fan of Spider-Man is not like liking Batman. To really appreciate Spider-Man in all mediums is to be constantly heartbroken by the bizarre and money-grubbing creative decisions made by Marvel Entertainment, Sony, and Disney, and other entities that may have control over the character. And I'm not just talking about movies and comics. One of the most frequently attempted versions of Spider-Man media is Spider-Man on TV, and more often than not, it's a resounding failure. And I'm not talking about things like Nicholas Hammond or Japanese Spider-Man that are products of the time they were made or of their environment. Those things are fun and they do have charm. I'm talking mostly about Spider-Man cartoons. Because, and this is maybe the hottest take of this whole video, Spider-Man cartoons are usually bad. And I'm just calling it like I see it. Even the one that I love the most, that is widely considered to be the best Spider-Man cartoon, don't forget it ends with Spider-Man and all the other characters realizing that they are works of fiction within the universe of the show. What? It was all meaningless. And they do these things to us. They just don't get what the fans want to see. And that's why this show caught me so off guard. Wow. It's something that came out in 2008 before Mark Webb does his take on Spider-Man and well before Tom Holland is ever in the costume. Right after Spider-Man 3 has divided the nation, I'll go that big with it. This is one of the most polarizing movies of all time. It's a surprise that a Spider-Man show that came out at that time felt so respectful to what the fans wanted to see from Spider-Man and actually understands who Spider-Man, Peter Parker, and all of the other characters in the Spider-Man universe are. And better than understanding who they are, this show actually knew how to use all of these classic characters to tell a really mature and engaging Spider-Man story from start to finish. So, as a lifelong Spider-Man fan, I just watched Spectacular Spider-Man for the first time. I'll give you all of my thoughts, and we'll walk away from this a little bit enriched. Spider pun. But before we do, I want to tell you all about my partnership with NordVPN and how you can use them not only to browse the internet safely, but also to find great shows and hidden gems just like Spectacular Spider-Man. Listen, it's a scary time, and I'm not exaggerating when I say that tons of entities and individuals are trying to steal your personal information and your browsing data. Especially if you're somebody like me who works using the internet all the time and often has to do it in public places on public Wi-Fi, like at a coffee shop or an internet cafe. That's where I work most of the time because of a crippling caffeine addiction. And that's just the first of many reasons why you should be using NordVPN. NordVPN is like incognito mode that actually works. It masks your identity and all of your browsing data when you're using public Wi-Fi, so you can feel confident that you're being safe while using the internet. Better yet, Nord's no logs policy also means that even NordVPN isn't tracking what you're doing or sleuthing your data. But it's not all just about safety. NordVPN also has some really fun features to enhance your internet browsing experience. My favorite of these features being increased access to television and movies that you wouldn't normally be able to find on stream. Let me explain. Taking it back to a month ago when I first decided that I was going to make this video about Spectacular Spider-Man. This show is not on any streaming platform in the United States. This is due to a rights issue between Disney and Sony. It's no longer on Disney Plus, nor is it on Netflix here in the States where I call home. In fact, American Netflix only has 2 Spider-Men to offer me, one Andrew Garfield and one Lego. And I've watched them 1 million times a piece. I watch both of these a lot. However, if you're like me and you're in a bind and you need to find a show, chances are that show is on Netflix or a different streaming service, and it's just being masked and hidden from you because it's not available in your area. This is where NordVPN comes in. Well, you wouldn't normally be able to watch the show. A few quick clicks and you can connect to a server from Austria or Australia or Brazil, just for example, and bingo bango bongo, as Spider-Man would say. That's his catchphrase. You're watching Spectacular Spider-Man on Netflix, all thanks to NordVPN. So if you're like me and you're a cinephile or just a really hardcore Spider-Man fan who needs to see every on-screen outing, NordVPN is nearly essential. NordVPN is also worry-free with a 30-day money-back guarantee. Seriously, I do encourage you, as the world moves forward and the internet gets more dangerous, be safe, be smart, use NordVPN. Follow the link in the description for more details on exclusive offers from NordVPN, or use coupon code OTHERPRODUCTION. It was actually really hard for me to come up with things to discuss about Spectacular Spider-Man. But as you can see from the runtime of this video, I definitely did it, don't worry. And I think that just comes down to that I liked this show so much. When it comes to criticism, it's just much easier for me to tear apart something that I don't like and point to the reasons that I dislike that thing than it is for me to articulate why I love something. And I guess that really comes down to that it's easier to point out a shortcoming than it is to point out a strength. Case in point, this is why my Morbius video was almost 30 minutes long, while my Spider-Man No Way Home review was 12 minutes. Make no mistake, Spider-Man No Way Home is the better film. In fact, it's one of the best films, period. And maybe knowing that I was going to review this show while I was watching it actually did make me look for things to dislike, just because I knew that I was going to pull content out of it. But this was a real problem because this show is so solid. In fact, when you look at the notes that I took while I was watching the show in real time, you can actually see me try to identify a problem, and then the show turns around and fixes that problem, and I have to make a note that I take that back. Of course, I could have just crossed out. Spectacular Spider-Man is a really charming and accurate representation of what teenage Spider-Man is supposed to be. It also understands that melodrama in a Spider-Man story is actually much more important than the Spider-Man versus villain story that moves the plot along. Because like I've always said, a good Spider-Man story is completely dependent on the interaction between Peter Parker and the side characters that make up the rest of the world. Definitely the strongest part of the show is how it handles almost every player in Peter Parker's life. From Aunt May to MJ to Gwen Stacy to Norman Osborn. No character feels too small for the story and none of them get the short end of the stick. But where this side really shines is how it handles minor characters in Peter Parker's life, like Betty Brant, Liz Allen, and most of all, Flash Thompson. Each character has their own arc throughout the show. None of them are two-dimensional, even if they aren't the main cast like MJ, Gwen, and Harry. And some of these arcs are very small and minor, and some of them are very major, like Flash Thompson going from the guy who's beating up on the kid to Flash Thompson becoming the guy that stands up for what's right because it's the right thing. And that's what Spider-Man is about, even when other characters do it instead of Peter. Specifically, the villains are the real standout of this show. I really appreciate that each villain is tied into the last story that we saw. And I'm glad to say this because Spider-Man has the greatest rogues gallery in all of comics. Batman fans can fight me. One of these guys has 4 metal arms, and that's pretty cool. Almost all of the villains were made by previous villains who fought Spider-Man. For example, Doc Ock creates Sandman, Lizard creates Electro, Norman Osborn makes Vulture, and then that makes the funniest soundbite on the whole show.
All clear? Osborn!
And then, as a brilliant plot twist, Tombstone starts making villains to distract Spider-Man from interfering in the underground crime scene. This one little plot device, first of all, makes all the villains feel well thought out and fleshed out like they're valuable parts of the story, but it also makes the story feel very streamlined, like every episode is feeding into the next one, and like we're growing towards something with each new installment of the show. I really like that. Of course, Peter is the #1 element needed to make a Spider-Man story work in all facets. And the way this show handles Peter is absolutely wonderful. This is that classic take on the Peter Parker who's down on his luck and whose life as a regular high school student and as a superhero are so constantly interfering with each other. I particularly like that this Peter is not always losing though. He's definitely unlucky and things definitely happen to him and pile on, but this show also allows Peter to win sometimes. He gets his job at the Bugle, he gets his promotion, Gwen and Liz and MJ are all into him. He's not put upon, but every time that he does have a success, it turns around and makes everything else he's dealing with vastly more complicated. And I thought that was a really interesting take to go with it, because usually you just see life kick him while he's down. And I love that too. But it's nice to see someone figure out how to sometimes treat him well without it violating who the character is. So hopefully I've gushed enough about some of my positives of this show, and you'll forgive me for having a few negatives. As I've said now, this show is nearly the masterclass in how to tell a really good Spider-Man story. But I do have a few nitpicks. And before you get upset, because I know to a lot of Spider-Man fans this is like coming after the Raimi movies, this show is thought of as perfect. These are just my opinions. They don't need to be your opinions. First of all, as good as a lot of the characters are, there are some significant character fumbles in this show. One character who you'll notice I left off of my list of side characters that I love is Eddie Brock. In typical Sony Spider-Man fashion, Venom feels very much like an afterthought that got forced into a much better Spider-Man story. Eddie kind of feels like an obligation in this show to me, which is a bummer because every other character that we meet feels like a very natural inclusion to the world of Spectacular Spider-Man. Because the 2 seasons of the show really have 4 main Spider-Man stories going on. Tombstone making villains, and then eventually trying to contract Spider-Man is one story. It's a constant threat that is always there hanging over the characters. Doc Ock being a mastermind who creates the Sinister Six is another really great addition to the show, constantly stepping up the stakes so that Spider-Man doesn't win easily every time. Best of all, there's the 2-season Green Goblin arc, which is so well written that it actually made me question something I've known since I was 5 years old. Is Norman Osborn the Green Goblin? And then there's the Venom subplot, which stands out because the other 3 subplots that I mentioned are all connected to each other. They feed into each other. Venom is completely separate from any of those. It's its own side thing. And maybe that would work in a longer show. You could dedicate a full season to that, for example. But it doesn't work as a couple of side episodes that you throw into the end of a season. J. Jonah Jameson. This is one of my favorite characters in all of Spider-Man, so of course my expectations are a little bit high, with other great iterations of him like Ed Asner in the animated series, and of course J.K. Simmons in the Raimi trilogy and now the Tom Holland trilogy. And this is a complicated complaint because season 1 handles Jonah beautifully, and then that falls off in season 2 hard. The real thing about J. Jonah Jameson is he's not just a cranky guy that's obsessed with getting Spider-Man. That's layer 1. Underneath that is that J. Jonah Jameson actually believes he's doing the right thing. He's actually a good person and a stand-up guy. Season 1 has some great moments where they show off that stand-up guy underneath the veneer of an angry man. It straight up rips the scene from Spider-Man 1 where Jonah doesn't give up Peter to Green Goblin. They do the same thing with Rhino, and it works here. It's a great moment and I don't mind seeing it duplicated. But my personal favorite J. Jonah Jameson moment in this show is at the end of season 1 when Spider-Man fights the Sinister Six and the Bugle goes to report on it. Jonah is told that one of the people watching the fight with the Sinister Six had a heart attack. And he jumps on that eagerly to say, oh great, they'll be the victim for the story, until someone tells him that that person was Peter's Aunt May. Suddenly, he no longer wants to go after that person for the story. He removes himself and says, I'm going to call Peter myself and tell him. It's so well played and so mature, it actually belongs in a live-action Spider-Man movie. And then season 2 kinda opts for Jonah to be a side gag character.
Crap, mega crap.
And that can work sometimes, but I would prefer that you continue that development while still having him be funny. The Jonah in season 2 is one note. The Jonah in season 1 is a real fleshed out character. Last on my list of criticisms, we have to talk about the animation. I know this is a very common complaint for this show, because it's one of the main things that stopped me from watching it for so long. I know I should have an open mind, and stylized animation is not inherently bad. But this animation and these character designs, I just have a hard time connecting with. I was really hoping that that wouldn't be the case once I started watching the show, but it is the greatest downfall of Spectacular Spider-Man. And when the show is Peter interacting with his friends and family and being a normal guy, that's all well and good. The writing saves it, but the formula for an early episode of Spectacular Spider-Man is some great Peter drama for the first 10 minutes, and then 10 minutes of action. And of course you have to have action on a Spider-Man show. Spider-Man has to fight someone. But the action would work better if I was connected with what it looked like. In later episodes, and especially in season 2, they do step up in this department. The animation doesn't get any better, but rather than the fights being Spider-Man punches the bad guy and does a really cool kick, and then he wins, it's Spider-Man is overpowered by the bad guy and has to think of a cool way to stop him using his brain and his intellect. Because when you think out the action scenes like that and there's a little kicker to them, it's now not a visual thing. Moving on from negatives, I do want to take some time to talk about the very best story on the entire show. I talked briefly about the Goblin arc being my favorite that the entire cartoon has to offer. In fact, not only is it my favorite story from the show, I think this is one of the best retellings of the Green Goblin story we've ever seen in anything Spider-Man. It's up there with Willem Dafoe, it's up there with Ultimate Spider-Man. First of all, I like how the treatment of Goblin in the show is very similar to Joker on Batman the Animated Series. It's not a debate that he is Spider-Man's biggest foe on the entire show. And when he comes in, he's not just making problems for Spider-Man, he's making problems for the other characters, including the bad guys. And the show actually builds up a really nice rivalry between Green Goblin and Spider-Man. So much so that it's actually a shame we didn't get to see what they were gonna do with Gwen Stacy. I know it's a children's show, and I know it might have been hard to do the death of Gwen Stacy in it, but with her as the primary love interest for Peter, and with an actual rivalry going on between Peter and the Goblin, it just would have made so much sense. Because that rivalry is what made the death of Gwen Stacy work so well in the comics. It wasn't just that Green Goblin killed a character in the story. It was that Spider-Man and Green Goblin had been going back and forth for decades with no clear winner. Now there was one, and it wasn't Spider-Man. That only works if you have a Spider-Man that has been going at it with Green Goblin for a little while now. That's exactly why it fell a little flat in Amazing Spider-Man 2. So when you have a show that ends with Peter saying he wants to be with Gwen, it only makes sense to me that had they ever come back, they could have done a really beautiful job at handling this classic Spider-Man story. However, side tangents aside, what they do manage to do with Peter, Harry, and Norman in this show is something truly special. The identity fake out with Goblin being Harry starts as just like a nice little left turn that, oh, in this version, Harry Osborn is the Goblin before Norman. That's a really good surprise for fans. And then in season 2, when it turns around and says, actually, Harry was never the Goblin, and maybe Norman wasn't either. And they actually wind up faking me, someone who knows Norman Osborn is the Goblin. Legitimately surprising to adult, longtime Spider-Man fans. I still have no idea how they did that. And it's on a children's Disney XD Saturday morning cartoon. Overall, this show is a very strong take on the Spider-Man that fans have come to know and expect. In fact, so many of the show's ideas about Spider-Man are so interesting and so original that it's almost a bummer when it's just trying to be a normal Spider-Man status quo kind of show. There's nothing wrong with the traditional take on Spider-Man and Peter Parker, obviously, and this show does that really well. But I've also been a Spider-Man fan for a really long time, and I've taken in a lot of different kinds of Spider-Man media, and so I'm intimately familiar with this story. I've seen it before. So while I do prefer that something new do a traditional Spider-Man thing, once you've proven to me that you can mix it up and change things a little bit and still have it be really, really good and fulfilling for the audience, I prefer that you do that over the traditional thing that I've seen in comics, movies, and TV my whole entire life. I almost wonder if those later seasons that they were going to do would have been more of that for me. But as it stands, this is a really, really tight Spider-Man show that I definitely think all Spider-Man fans should experience at least once. Find it, watch it, give it a try. I promise you, you won't regret it. I give it an A-. Hopefully you also thought this video was really, really good. Maybe you like the look of it and you're a filmmaker yourself. If that's the case, my entire gear list is listed with Amazon affiliate links in the description. If you are looking for any of this gear and you buy it that way, it does help support the channel in a big way. Of course, you can also support the channel the old-fashioned and free way by hitting subscribe, which will keep you up to date on all of the things that we do here, including Spider-Man news, reviews, as well as general entertainment, pop culture, food reviews, movie reviews, and maybe the occasional sketch or short film. I'm trying to do everything, and your support is what makes that all happen. Thank you so much for watching. I'm Oliver the Ricketts. I need a haircut, and I love Spider-Man. Hi everybody, Editing Oliver here. Just jumping in to interrupt one more time to tell you that while I was editing this video, Spectacular Spider-Man was in fact added to American Netflix. I did in fact use NordVPN as I watched it before Netflix had the show. And while I was doing that, I found all these other great titles that you can access with NordVPN on Netflix. Remember when everybody was really upset that The Office and Friends were leaving the streaming service? Well, in other countries, they're still there and you can access it with NordVPN. Or if you want to stick with Spider-Man, Spider-Man 2 and Into the Spider-Verse, arguably the two best Spider-Man films, are also available in these territories, which you can access with NordVPN. So sign up today and start taking advantage of all that NordVPN has to offer. Check out the link in the description for exclusive offers on NordVPN.